Great. Thanks, Ian. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for taking the time to join us today. Um, yeah, as Ian mentioned in his introduction, I've been at this for a while, and I developed this passion for sharing these kinds of techniques and skills with folks because I sure needed them when I was when I was younger. And the stuff we're going to talk about today, which slide along here, the stuff we're going to talk about today is really you're going to end up feeling like, wow, this is incredibly simple, and yet it is super powerful. And it's a technique that I learned really without exaggeration about 30 years ago. And a lot of the stuff that I got taught 30 years ago has not stood the test of time, right? And, you know, are not practices that I would still employ. But this one has stood the test of time. It's really simple. It's really easy to apply. And I think you'll appreciate that as we go through the content. So we're going to, at first, just level set on a little bit of terminology, just kind of keep us calibrated on what we're talking about. And then we'll talk about the risk management model that really comes down to two keywords, which we'll get into in a moment. And then we'll want to give some examples of what I'm calling some failure modes of what happens when this simple model doesn't actually get applied, right? And I strongly suspect you're going to recognize some patterns when we go through that. And so ultimately, the goal here is to help you avoid some of those patterns and think about risk in a way that makes it easier for you to manage and gives you more confidence in the decisions that you're making when you do that. Happy to take questions at the end, but also happy to take questions throughout. Would love for this to be more interactive than me speaking into the void for the whole time. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat, or you can even unmute your mic and just raise them verbally if you like. I think we had some folks who joined after Ian made that announcement earlier, so just reminding folks of that. Okay, so let's get into it. So I'm going to start with the really basic level setting on what do we even mean by risk when we're talking about this, right? Because risk, I think we all have a general understanding of what risk is about, but it's valuable to make sure we are consistent in how we're talking about it. And the definition that I'm going to use here is intentionally generic, right? So in this context, as we're talking about risk today, really we just mean the possibility that something undesirable will happen, right? And there's two bits of emphasis there, right? It's possible. It means it's not guaranteed, right? So there's uncertainty. It may or may not happen. And of course, it hasn't happened yet, right? Something that has already happened and that is a problem or undesirable, that's an issue that you're managing, and you deal with that in a different way because you have certainty that it's happening, right? So the thing that makes risk a bit of a challenge is it may or may not actually happen. So again, this definition is intentionally generic. I'm going to try to use some examples from the world of software. We're going to use some examples that are not from the world of software, just to highlight that this simple framework can be valuable for you in a whole bunch of different contexts. You know, whether it's different business domains, it's your work life, it's your personal life, you know, it's kind of universally applicable. Okay, so here's the core message. If you take nothing else away from our time together today, this is the one, you know, the one thing that all boils down to. There are two key attributes by which all risk can be evaluated: probability and impact, right? So what do we mean by those terms? Probability is quite simply how likely is it that this undesirable event is going to occur. Now, what we're not talking about here is trying to get to some precision of, you know, it's exactly 23% likely that this is going to, right? Clearly that's not simple and applicable in practice, right? We can't ever get to that level of precision. But we don't need to. What we need to do is ask ourselves some basic questions about, like, well, does this happen all the time? Or is this a, you know, once in a blue moon kind of a thing? Does it only happen when something else comes first? And so now, okay, how likely is that thing to happen, right? Or is it getting more likely or less likely over time, right? And so, you know, just thinking about these kinds of questions helps us gauge, you know, on a relative scale, how likely is it that this risk is going to occur? Similarly, we can look at impact, right? Impact is what's the big deal if it happens, right? Why is this undesirable? Well, it's because it's going to cost us something. Maybe it's going to cost us some money if, you know, we can't take orders on our system, or it's going to take us some time to fix a problem, right? So there's an effort impact there as well, right? There's some, you know, so those are some of the things that you can quantify, right? How big is the impact? There can also be qualitative impact, which is, well, it's, you know, if, you know, the users are going to have a bad experience because the system's not going to perform well. Can we quantify the impact of that? How many people will abandon our system, our site, excuse me, before they place an order? Maybe, like, maybe we can, maybe we can't, but it's still a bad thing. Like, we know that it's bad. We don't have to quantify it to know that it's bad. And you can see other examples of that, right? Sometimes the impact could just be you're going to let somebody down, right? If the risk you're managing is, you know, what's the risk that we don't get this done on time, right? Well, you know, maybe there's a tangible impact, but you're also going to erode the trust of whoever you committed to that you're going to get it done, right? So those kinds of things can be impacts as well. And it's important to recognize that the measurement of impact, what's considered a low, medium, or high impact, can be vastly different in different contexts, right? So, you know, if you're writing the control software for the 737 MAX airplane, right, the impact of you getting that wrong is unfortunately hundreds of lives lost, right? If you're, you know, writing a small application for internal use that, you know, has 6 users who will get tremendous value out of it, but, you know, if there's a bug, it's, you know, it's an inconvenience for them, but it's not, you know, not nearly as big a deal. The scale in which you evaluate low, medium, high is going to be completely different, right? If you're writing a financial system for a bank, right, the impact of bugs in that system, you know, what you consider to be high impact will be very different from if you're writing a system at a different scale. And again, this premise applies in all kinds of contexts outside of software as well. And so we don't need to worry about creating absolute measures of low, medium, and high, right? It is perfectly okay for it to be relevant to the context for the risk that we're talking about. So managing risk is basically about striking a balance, right? Because the things that we do to reduce the probability, which would be preventive measures, or the things that we do to reduce the impact of a potential risk, which would be the contingency measures that we take, they all cost something, right? It's the time that we have to spend, the effort that we're putting in could cost money that we have to spend. You know, if we're going to spin up new environments, if we're going to have an entire backup facility available to us, or just, you know, the work effort that we're going to put in costs money, right? What we want to do is we want to scale those efforts. We want to size them in a way that is appropriate based on the magnitude of the impact that we're trying to avoid, which is further complicated by the fact that we don't actually know for sure that it's going to happen, right? Like, how much time and energy should we put in to managing this risk is very different depending on how likely we think the risk is, right? And that's where the complexity comes in. It's also important to note that when I talk about contingency measures, which is, you know, what are we going to do if this happens? Excuse me, what are we going to do to reduce the impact if this happens? In the context we're talking about this, that relates to things that you're doing before the event actually happens, right? You could make a contingency plan, right? In which case, before the event happens, your action is you're making the plan, right? You might choose to not actually implement the actions in your plan until after the event happens, right? As opposed to some other things where you might decide, you know what, we really need to get ahead of this and deal with it now, right? So just level setting on that terminology as well. Okay, so with all of that, wouldn't be a good consultant if I didn't have a quadrant-based matrix model, right? So if we take a look at these on two axes of probability and impact, and we just sort of plot them against each other, the chart is going to make it look like there's a distinctive boundary between low and medium, or medium and high, and that is of course not the case, right? These are all continuum, right? They're not discrete. But for the sake of illustration, let's take this in a few different buckets. And so first of all is the lower left portion of the quadrant, where you've got low probability and low impact. And honestly, the thing to do with these risks is not worry about them, right? And that's perfectly okay, right? If it's a conscious choice, right? We'll talk later about when it's not a conscious choice is when it can be a problem. But if you think about it and you say, you know what, the scenario that we're worried about is, it's not very likely. And if it happens, like, yeah, we'll deal with it, we'll roll with it. Then, you are perfectly justified in going no further in taking efforts to prevent or otherwise manage that risk. And similarly, as we go further to the right on this scale, we're still dealing with low impact events. The implication if this happens is not that big. So let's not go crazy doing anything about it. We should do something. Maybe we put some light prevention measures in place. So, if the risk we're looking at is, we're working on an application and it has some integration touch points with other applications. And so we need to do some integration testing, and we have the possibility that when we deploy to our test environment, the instance that we need of the other applications is not up and running, right? Or in some other way isn't ready for us to test with. So, you might say, well, okay, one simple light prevention measure we could do, that we could just check before we run, before we actually try to run the test. And if this doesn't happen very often, or the system is pretty reliable and it's usually up, maybe we would just do that manually, right? Because it's not really worth any more effort than that. And maybe we would say, well, you know what? The probability is getting high, like this is pretty normal for this system to be down. Yeah, let me actually put a smoke test in my deployment so that I can at least find that out before we try to go any further, right? And that's a pretty quick, easy thing for us to do. So, it's a fairly light contingency measure for us to put in place. But as you go further up as you go further up the impact scale, right? See, well, we maybe need to do a bit more, right? Because now the effort that we're going to put in to either preventing the risk from occurring or dealing with that impact, right? There's a greater likelihood that we're going to need it, right? And that we're going to get value out of it. And because the impact is larger, it's worth more investment to prevent it, right? So, now maybe we might automate a little bit more of that testing of the environments, right? We might go to the owners of those environments and say, hey, we need to collaborate with you a bit more on making sure that that our deployments are in sync, or that that the data that we're using is being refreshed on some cycle, right? And we put some more energy into managing this risk, because if it happens, we're dead in the water. We're losing weeks worth of time as opposed to we're losing minutes worth of time, right? Again, there's different ways the impact could play out. And as the impact grows, we want to put more energy in, right? So we might do some more moderate contingency measures and maybe even go further out of our way to actually prevent this from happening. And then, of course, as the impact grows even further, the level of effort that you put into managing it grows even further, right? So I think, the theme is probably evident at this point. Interestingly, sort of the red box here is okay, this is the highest impact, highest probability risk. We obviously have to do our best to really try to prevent these from happening in the first place and know what our plan is going to be. This is, system is down, people can't place orders, we're losing money. Okay, let's make sure we have the monitoring in place to identify problems that are growing before they cause the system to go down. Or, let's make sure we have the backup in place. And, do we need 5 nines reliability on the system? Well, if you're a retailer on Black Friday, maybe that's an issue for you. If you are running a website where you get, a couple hundred hits a day and it's just informative for people, you're not going to take those kinds of measures, right? That's the construct. I personally actually think the hardest risks to manage are the ones that are here in this category of high impact, low probability. These are the things like your house burning down, right? To take it out of the software context, right? Like, well, what do you do about those, right? Like, it's pretty low likelihood, but if it happens, it's catastrophic. How much energy do you put into managing those kinds of risks can often be a very difficult decision, right? Now, in the case of your house burning down, you have options like you go out and you buy insurance, right? There's literally an entire industry that exists to help the world deal with these kinds of risks. We obviously don't always get that luxury when we're dealing with our software problems or many other things in our lives. And if you live in Oakland, California, like I do, even fire prevention, like, well, we have wildfires out here. So every year, in fact, last week, I got the notice from the fire department that says it's inspection time. And they come out and they inspect our properties. And they say, if you have any trees overhanging your roof, you need to get them trimmed. And if you don't, we're going to fine you, right? Because the probability of there being a fire is higher than is typical. And so we take prevention measures out here to deal with that, right? So again, it actually gets slightly easier to manage as the probability goes up, which is a little bit ironic. But in the situations where the probability is low, it's a lot harder to figure out what's the right amount of effort and time and money, et cetera, to invest in preventing the catastrophic event. So that's the model. Again, there is no defined, this makes it look like there's a defined border between low and medium, right? There is, of course, not. All of these are on a continuum. And I imagine there's some of you out there who are going, wow, this is just like ridiculously simple. There's like, duh, why are we spending time talking about all of this? And that's a fair reaction because it is that simple. And yet there are plenty of scenarios where people fail to apply this kind of thinking. And I'm going to give you some examples of those. I think they'll resonate. So let's talk about some failure modes. So the first failure mode is, the ostrich burying its head in the sand. Like you just don't even think about any of this at all, right? Which typically comes from just not recognizing that there even is a realistic probability that something could go wrong, right? This could be the like, oh yeah, no problem. This is a one-line code change, right? It's not, not going to be an issue. We'll just, bang this up to production. Yeah, we don't need to test this, right? Hopefully you all aren't doing too much of these kinds of things, right? But the reality is this happens, right? Where people just simply charge ahead and they never stop to even consider that there could be some risk. Excuse me a moment. So, that one hopefully is fairly straightforward to avoid. The second failure mode I want to talk about is what I call the what if failure mode. This is the failure mode where you spend too much time worrying about improbable scenarios or low impact scenarios, right? Where you start looking for all the edge cases, right? And of course, there's value in looking for the edge cases up to a point, right? And when you're looking at the edge cases, you have to be thinking about probability, right? And so, what if a disk fails, in the data center, that's running our database? Like, well, how likely is that, right? And if we're paying our friendly cloud service provider of choice to manage all this for us, and that's on them, and they're guaranteeing us a reliability. Like, is this something we really need to worry about? Well, again, there are scenarios where maybe the answer to that question is yes, if it's an incredibly high impact, if it happens. but most of the time that's probably low enough probability, and it's something that we probably don't need to be putting huge emphasis on. The other version of this failure mode, and actually I think sometimes what might even be the more common one, at least in my experience, is there's this sort of ironic scenario where negative outcome can be the result of a positive outcome, right? And so an example of that would be, this application that we're building takes off, somebody tweets about it, it goes viral, and all of a sudden we have 500,000 users hitting our system, and we never expected that it was going to get that much attention. That's a great outcome. We should be celebrating that. But if our system crashes or performance goes to heck, right, because of all that load, well, clearly that's a negative outcome that we'd be dealing with, right? And so because we want to be optimistic, right, we start thinking ahead and planning for those scenarios, right? Oh, let's make sure our system can handle this kind of load because it could happen. We go, well, it could happen, but how likely is it to happen, right? Like that's a reasonable question to be asking, to say, is this really a problem we need to deal with now, right? Will we get indications that load is growing in enough time that we could spin up additional capacity if we need to and avoid a problem? Like, do we really need to deal with it? Like this, the spike in user activity would have to come in such a short span of time that we wouldn't have the ability to react. How likely is that, right? There's a version of this that I actually lived recently, as it turns out, right? So I'm, as Ian mentioned in the intro, I'm a golfer. I'm a very bad golfer, but I enjoy playing. And on the 5th hole of my favorite golf course, there's a hole where there is a creek that is about 270 yards or so from the tee, but it runs kind of back to front and along the side of the hole and closer to the tee. On the right side of the hole, it gets closer to the tee. It's theoretically possible I could hit my ball in that creek. And for a long time, I used to not pull out my driver, which is for those who don't know anything about golf, which is the club you hit when you want to hit it the farthest you can possibly hit it. And I would not use that club because I was worried about the risk I might hit the ball in the creek. And then one day I sort of realized exactly how far out it is. And I said, when I mishit my shot, which is often, I don't usually mishit it in that direction where I'm likely to end up in the creek. And I never hit the ball 270 yards if I hit it straight. The probability of this happening is actually really quite low. And even though the impact in the context of my golf game, the impact is large because if you hit the ball in the creek, you take penalty shots, right? So, in the grand scheme of the world, that's pretty low impact, but in the context of my golf game, it's meaningful. And so I used to take the prevention measure of not hitting that club. I would hit the ball shorter distance. And ironically, what that would do is it meant that creek that I was trying to avoid on the first shot was actually in play on my second shot, right? And it made my second shot harder, right? And so it wasn't until I realized, the probability of my actually hitting my shot in the creek is really quite low. I should accept that risk. So now I do. So now I hit driver off the tee and the second shot is much easier and I do better on that golf hole because I realized that I was being overly optimistic about my ability to end up with that negative outcome. So there you go. Even with 30 years of having lived this, I'm also subject to the occasional what if thinking. All right, another failure mode. It's important to be looking at both probability and impact when you're doing these assessments. And so it's fairly common for people to only pay attention to one half of that balance. In the software world, one place where this plays out is in security, where we spend a lot of energy focusing on how we're going to prevent a breach, right? And we do penetration testing to make sure that our network is secure, right? And we engineer our software to make sure that it's secure. But the CIO of a client of mine that I served in the past actually said something that was really interesting to me once. So he was a CIO of a large retailer. And so e-commerce for them is actually huge, right? But he said to me once that, there's no way that we have the ability to stay ahead of the bad actors that are out there, right? I have to accept the reality that despite all of our efforts to prevent people from getting into our systems, at some point the hackers are better than we are, right? Somebody's going to get into our systems. And so I also need to be paying attention to how do I minimize the damage if that happens, right? How do I contain what they could possibly get access to? How do I find it if it happens and be able to, so that I'm able to act on it? And I actually thought that was perhaps the most interesting thing that gentleman ever said to me in the 5 years I worked with him. It was a really, I thought, sound way of looking at that problem, because he knew that the probability the probability was higher than he realistically wanted it to be, right? And so he knew he had to be putting measures into looking into the impact as well. The flip side of this is if you only look at impact and don't really look at probability. And different people have different tolerances. We'll talk about that in a moment for different impacts. But I personally find this is very common when we're dealing with medical situations. I found myself really frustrated earlier. I guess this would have been sort of beginning of last winter. So I don't know, sort of October, November-ish, when in the midst of our COVID pandemic that we're of course all living, word started to come out that doctors were really, really highly recommending that people get flu shots. Like, it's way more important this year to get a flu shot than it normally is, because we don't want people in the hospitals with the flu, because we don't have that capacity in the hospitals, because the hospitals are all dealing with COVID. And on the surface, that all sounds entirely reasonable until you think about, wait, how likely is it that I'm going to get the flu when I'm not leaving my house, right? I'm in lockdown, right? For all the reasons that, we're living around COVID, is this really a risk? And so I found myself sort of scratching my head over these recommendations. And sure enough, several months later, the news started coming out that said, hey, flu cases were dramatically lower this year than they historically are. And it's like, yeah, because nobody could get the flu because people weren't interacting with each other and transmitting the flu to each other. So anyway, this is one example. There are others that come to mind that I won't ramble about, but this is a fairly common situation in medical situations where we're so afraid of the impact of something that we put a lot of energy and some would argue a lot of cost into our medical system into preventing circumstances because we're so afraid of the impact of them, even though those circumstances are actually quite low probability. The next failure mode is the one that I call pound of prevention. So we're probably all familiar with the phrase, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And obviously the whole theme of this discussion that we're having is kind of aligned with that, right? That like sometimes prevention is the right thing as compared to dealing with the impact, but it's not the case all the time. And the failure mode here is when an ounce of prevention actually becomes a pound of prevention, where the effort, the cost, whatever it is you're going to do to prevent the undesirable event from occurring is actually the same as what it would cost you to deal with it if it occurs, right? And so what you're doing is you're saying, well, I don't know for sure if this will happen. If it happens, here's what I'm going to do. So let me do that now, even though it hasn't actually happened yet. Can you see why that would perhaps be unnecessary, right? Like, well, wait, if what I'm going to do if it happens is exactly the same as what I would do before it happens, why would I do it before it happens? I don't know if I need it yet. Why would I spin up a ton of infrastructure to deal with those 500,000 users if I don't know that I'm going to hit 500,000 users? And ultimately, what it costs me to spin up that infrastructure is the same later as it is now. Maybe if I just put a little bit of monitoring in place, I can know that I'm starting to have a problem and I'll learn it in time so that I could spin up that infrastructure instead of incurring the cost now when I don't actually know if I need it. So I had a situation a few years ago. You all can't see it, of course, in the Zoom, but I have recession in my gums here and below my bottom teeth. And so my dentist sent me to the periodontist and said, you know, hey, why don't you have him take a look at this? I said, okay, fine. I mean, this is not a new thing. It's been around for ages, but whatever. So I go to the periodontist, and the periodontist is talking to me about doing a graft where they take tissue from the top of your roof of your mouth, and they basically put it over, you know, the area where there's the recession. And he's recommending that I have this done. And I said, okay, what if I don't do this? And at some point, you know, the recession gets worse, and you know, we need to take action. What's the impact? And he said, well, we would do the graft. I said, okay, wait a minute. So you're telling me that the impact of the problem is we would do the graft, which is what you're recommending that we do right now. Like, why would I choose to do this now? And he didn't actually have a good answer to that. And I didn't have the surgery. And several years later, my gum recession hasn't got any worse, right? You know, it was this case of like, well, you know, if you want to prevent it from happening, here's what you do. But it's the same thing I would do if it does happen. And I go to the dentist twice a year, you're going to catch it in time before it gets bad enough that there's any other worse effects. Don't apply a pound of prevention. The next failure mode that comes into play is when you get more than one person involved in evaluating the risk, which, let's face it, is a pretty common occurrence for all of us. And you got people who have different views on how likely something is, right? It's like, oh, I'm really worried about us getting to 500,000 users. Like, no, I'm not worried about that at all, right? And so now you're not just dealing with assessing how likely is it for yourself, but you've got different opinions. And oftentimes there's no actual hard data available to know. Certainly if there is, that makes things much easier, right? And you might have people with very different experience bases, either just through, you know, age and accumulated wisdom, right? Or people who have lived through similar scenarios in the past versus others who have not. And so you get people who have widely different views on whether this is something that should get attention now or not. And so, you know, in this case, the guidance would be, you know, ask why a lot, try to get to the bottom of why do you think that's very likely, you know, or why do you think that's not very likely? Like, what do you know that I don't know, right? Or what do you perceive is the case that I'm not seeing, right? There's something that's underlying that difference. Try to get to the bottom of it so that you can narrow the gap in that perception. And then sensitivity analysis can actually be really helpful here. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about sensitivity analysis, but basically what that is playing out scenarios and saying, well, all right, let's look at, you know, you're saying that you lived through this once before, and so you're afraid of this happening. So, okay, let's look at the conditions under which it happened before and see how likely are those, right? What if that bit happens? Where do we see opportunities for things to start to diverge as far as our perceptions about how likely this is? And what happens in different scenarios, and, you know, how do we again sort of narrow the gap in our perceptions? All of this can also apply on the impact side of things, where different people have different tolerance for negative outcome. This is the case between my wife and I. My wife is much more risk averse than I am, just sort of in general. There's often no data about how big the outcome, the impact of something is going to be. You just kind of have to try to work through finding common ground. Again, the sensitivity analysis can help, where you say, okay, if this happens, like, what will we do? What, you know, and how big a difference is there between what I'm thinking and what you're thinking? The other thing that can be complex about this one is there can be cultural differences. I actually learned this lesson when the first time I worked overseas. I did a project in Ireland for about 9 months, and there were a handful of us from the US who were working there. And we were busting our butts to get this project live on time. That was kind of the culture of that company at the time, at least in the US. And a bunch of the folks who were there, the local team, they were way more chill about it than we were. And really kind of had more of an attitude of, you know, if it's broken when it hits production, we'll fix it. And that was really hard to adjust to, right? It's like, wait, no, that just makes no sense to me. We need to be getting these things right. We need to be addressing these issues that we know are problems with this system. And it took me a while to sort of recognize that, well, look, they're not wrong. It's just a different view, and their attitude towards work-life balance was very different from mine. And I was a guest in their country, not the other way around, right? And so, okay, recalibrate what the tolerance for negative outcome is, and how much people are willing to invest to prevent that negative outcome. And so, you know, it was just a cultural difference, right? And you know, obviously I'm speaking in generalities about folks that I was working with in Ireland. And so it doesn't mean it applies to every Irish person everywhere, like every stereotype. But the reality is, this is true, right? In Japan, right, the tolerance for negative outcome is much lower than it is, say, in Ireland or even in the US, right? Just it's a cultural thing. Neither good nor bad. It just creates differences in how people view risk and what they're willing to spend to prevent that risk, or to you know, to put contingencies in place. So, you know, be aware of that as you're interacting with your teammates on these kinds of scenarios. All right, so hopefully that has been useful. It's always hard to tell when you know, speaking to an not empty, to a bunch of static Zoom images. I welcome questions and dialogue on this as we go. But ultimately, to close, you know, all of this that I've been talking about is not about eliminating risk. We're never going to eliminate risk. Risk is a reality in life, right? We don't have the perfect crystal ball to know what's going to happen. Bad things are going to happen. But you can reduce the likelihood that they happen by putting the right prevention measures in place. And you can reduce the pain when those things do happen by having the right contingency measures in place, right? And having thought about these things ahead of time, right? The fact that you know that it could happen and you accept the possible outcome goes a very long way to dealing with that outcome, right? Because it's not a surprise, it's something you've thought about. You knew that you intentionally didn't take the steps that would have been necessary to completely prevent the outcome because they weren't worth it, right? So when the bad thing happens, your mindset is quite different about it. It's also worth highlighting that all of this thinking can apply to positive outcomes as well, right? And we're focusing on risk management here, but the same notion of thinking about probability and impact can actually be valuable when you're, you know, thinking about an investment that you might make, or, you know, other scenarios where your focus is actually on positive outcome. The same mental construct can apply. So, in closing, remember two words: probability and impact. And if you think about those every time you're dealing with a situation of risk, you'll find yourself better able to handle that risk.